Aloha, welcome to our first UHERO Focus video for 2025, and I'm going to talk about our first quarter forecast report. And you may remember from our fourth quarter report, we were mostly focused on the uncertainty around a new administration in Washington and the policies that were kind of unclear at the time. Well, we now have more than a month to look at what those policies are and how they're playing out. And increasingly, it looks like these policies will weigh on Hawaii's economy and slow Hawaii's economic growth in 2025 and 2026. There are some bright spots. In particular, tourism held up reasonably well in 2024. Construction is still at very high levels of activity, and the U.S. economy is actually doing very well. So if you looked at U.S. job creation, for example, over all of 2024, on average, the U.S. created 160,000 new jobs every month, actually a little bit above that. And that's using the revised data. Now, the last 3 months, we actually saw over 200,000 jobs created. Fourth quarter of last year, consumer spending was up over 4%. Those are signs of a very robust economy. And that's really positive because Hawaii still relies on U.S. visitors. They make up 75% of the visitors to the state. Now, when we get the March employment report, these numbers are going to look quite different because by then the federal job cuts will start to show up. So we could see a very weak March report that'll come out the first week of April, and that'll be our first real evidence of the effects of the federal job cuts that you've been hearing about in the news. Now, in the Hawaii economy, as I mentioned, tourism held up reasonably well. These are average daily visitor census. All of the neighbor islands are measured on the right axis. Oahu is measured on the left axis. And you can see Oahu actually grew just a little bit during 2024. Maui continued its sort of slow recovery. By the end of 2024, average daily visitor census on Maui was still 16% below where it was pre-fire. Kauai and the Big Island were roughly flat, down just a little bit. Overall, real visitor spending fell last year. We think it'll stabilize in 2025. We think we'll actually get a boost of U.S. visitors in the beginning part of 2025 as we deal with some optimism around the new administration and maybe some prospects of some additional tax cuts that might stimulate the economy temporarily. But then as we go out further, latter half of 2025, early 2026, we think the federal policies that are being enacted are going to weigh on the U.S. economy. They're going to weigh on our international markets, and we'll see some weakness in the international market and U.S. visitors in 26 and 27. Now, the construction sector, as I mentioned already, has been the bright spot in Hawaii. And most of that is being driven by federal government spending at Pearl Harbor and then infrastructure spending around the islands. Now, as we go forward, the same policies I've already mentioned will begin to weigh on construction. Right? So the tariffs that are already in place, 10% on China, the Trump administration announced that the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico will in fact go into play in early March. And there have been announced 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. Those will act to drive up construction costs and weigh on that industry. Now, we think construction job count will probably peak around 41,000 workers in 2026. That will be a record high for an annual number, and then gradually fall off below the 41,000 mark. And fortunately, the states and counties have been working really hard to mobilize projects to add more housing. This chart shows the net addition to the housing stock for different decades, right? So you can see that if you can't quite see it from this chart, but if you do the calculations for the last decade, for the last 10 years, the number of housing units we've added is less than half what it was during the 2010s and about a quarter what it was back in the 1970s. So these additions, everything from renovations and rebuilding at Mayor Wright to Kakako Makai and TOD on Oahu, those are welcome additions. Many of them are in planning stages, but they have the potential to add needed housing and also to hold up that construction job count that I mentioned, even as some of the federal spending wanes. Now, the real concern most immediately is in the federal job cuts. Mostly we're hearing news about these nationally. There is no hard data on how many jobs have been eliminated nationally or in Hawaii. So we've taken what we think is a conservative approach and really just focused on the probationary workers that are not affiliated with DOD, not affiliated with the military in Hawaii at all. And the vast majority of Hawaii's 35,000 plus federal civilian workers are associated with DOD activities. So by our estimates, there's roughly 2,000 workers who are at risk of being let go because they were probationary. And we will know more in coming weeks as we start to see the unemployment insurance claims, and then later when we get the job counts. Notice we also think that some of these jobs will begin to be rehired, right? So these workers are doing important work at agencies that have mandates that can't be completed without workers. And so we think these job cuts are at least partly temporary. Now, it's not just the cuts to federal civilian workers. It's also cuts to contracts, grants, putting these on pause, and that will affect payroll jobs across many, many sectors in Hawaii, from healthcare to the University of Hawaii. State and local government are potentially could be facing some drag because of lost federal spending. So overall, we think that the job picture for Hawaii is one of no growth at all. So not an outright downturn, just no job growth as the federal cuts impact the state. If you were to sum everything up and look at Hawaii real GDP, the broadest measure of economic activity, our forecast for 2025 is for roughly 1.5% real GDP growth, down from 3%. That's because of the lost employment, the lost spending across the entire state and across multiple industries. Now, that's not a recession, right? It's just much weaker economic performance than we had expected. And businesses, policymakers, the legislature, administrators at the university, across the state, everyone is going to have to make adjustments and adapt to changing federal policy that will act as a drag on Hawaii's economy. Mahalo.